So I have mentioned this before in past studies of Hebrews, but if you were to try to discern what the meta argument is of the epistle, like what's the overarching argument that the author is trying to make, it is that the new covenant is superior to the old covenant. And he's making that argument because his readers, who are Jewish converts to Christianity, are tempted to go back to the old religion. They're being persecuted by their fellow Jews, and they want to live well with their co religionists. Hebrews is telling them that they cannot return back to Judaism because there's nothing to go back to. The old covenant is done away with. And he goes on to list all of the ways that the new covenant is superior to the old. So, one of the ways that it is superior is the fact that the new covenant gives us access to a better temple and a better city than the old covenant. The old covenant was focused around Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple, but there is a heavenly Jerusalem and a heavenly temple that is superior to the earthly one. And if you're a Christian, that is your inheritance. So this passage that we're reading focuses on two mountains. You have Mount Sinai and you have Mount Zion. So the first half of the reading focuses on Sinai, and the second half on Zion. Um, so in verse 18 it says, "For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest." And then verse 19 continues, "And the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them." So the idea of a blazing fire and a darkness and a tempest is something that you will see in Deuteronomy 4, verse 11. Um, and you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. And then in verse 522, it says, uh, 522 says, "These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice, and he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me and the heads of your tribes and your elders." Um, so notice that Zion, sorry, not Zion, Mount Sinai is filled with images of fire and darkness. It's a very terrifying sight. Um, in fact, the words that are used in Deuteronomy, if you look at the Septuagint version of Deuteronomy, it uses the same words in Greek uh, the as the book of Hebrews. So the word, let's see, um, so you have the word for darkness here, um, which is the word, um, okay, in Hebrew it is choshech, and in Greek it is the word skotos, gnophos, and thiela. So those are the words for darkness, cloud, and gloom. And then in Hebrews, you have the words gnophos and zophos and thveli. So two of the same three words occur here. The word skotos does not recur, and it's replaced by the word zophos, which means roughly the same thing. They're synonyms. But Hebrews is kind of establishing a verbal parallel with the Septuagint reading of Deuteronomy 4:11 here. So, assuming that the Hebrew readers of the Epistle of Hebrews were Hellenistic Jews, they would have read the Septuagint and they would have been familiar with that imagery. Now it says that because of how terrifying the image was, the people at Mount Sinai asked that no further messages be spoken to them. So you read about this in Exodus 20. verses 18 to 21. So here it says, and this is right after God gives the Ten Commandments, by the way. It says here, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So the people were afraid that if they heard God's voice, they would die. They had. Now, you might think it's a little bit superstitious, but actually, this is a healthy fear of the Lord. The people of Israel understood that God is too holy to be approached, and that they do not want to be in the presence of pure, unadulterated holiness, because that pure, unadulterated holiness would burn them up. Think about all the people who touched the Ark of the Covenant. Why do they all fall dead? It's because the Ark is too holy to be touched by human hands. It's the same thought here. And in verse 20 and 21, which is not part of the lectionary, it says, for they could not endure the order was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. So even Moses, the leader of the people, the one who spoke with God face to face and whose name shone like the brightness of the sun, even he was afraid. So the fear of God was the main thing that impressed itself on all the people. Notice it says, if even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. This is referring back to a command that was given in Exodus that no one should touch the mountain. So this is chapter 19, verse 12. It says, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. And then verse 13 says, no hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot, whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So the mountain was too holy for the people or the animals to go to touch. Only Moses could go up it. Now, contrast that with what we have in the New Covenant. So, the idea that Hebrews is painting for us is that it is different for us in the New Covenant. So, in verse 21, it says, but you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering. So, we get to come into the Holy of Holies, as it were. So, think about how when Jesus died, what happens in the temple? The curtain rips into two. The curtain was meant to symbolize the divide between divinity and humanity, saying that God is so transcendent that no man can come close to him. And the tearing of the curtain symbolized the fact that through the sacrifice of Christ, access has been made available to the presence of God. Um, as members of the new covenant, we believe that Christ is the one who gives us that access. And in the first epistle of John, St. John actually tells us that perfect love casts out fear, because the love of God comes into us and we are able to come to God and relate to him as a child to his father. Now, the motif of God being a father and his people as his children is in the Old Testament. It occurs in a couple of places, like in Malachi and in Isaiah. Even in Jewish prayers, God is referred to as Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. But the fatherhood of God is, how do I say this? It's affirmed in theory, but in practice, it's just words. In fact, fun fact, I've looked at a couple of Jewish sidurs, and the word av, father, does not get translated as father in most of them. It tends to be translated something else like creator or sovereign. It's almost like they're afraid to acknowledge that God is their Av, their father. Um, now going back to First John, I didn't read the relevant passage yet, and it's this: First John 4:16 to 19. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this, love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. Whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. St. John is saying that in Christ we have confidence before the throne of God. You know, we are able to be bold in approaching him. And that's something that was not the case in the old covenant. So the fact that we can do that in the new covenant is one of the evidences that the new covenant is superior. Now, this should not be understood. There is still a healthy fear of the Lord that we should have, but it's not the kind of servile fear that adherents of non Christian religions, such as Islam or Rabbinic Judaism, have. It is the fear of a child disappointing his father. It's like you don't want your dad to be disappointed because you got a C minus on your math test. Sorry, did I just bring back someone's trauma? My bad. But you get the idea here. So this goes to the idea of contrition. So in Catholic moral teaching, we talk about contrition. There's imperfect contrition and perfect contrition. Imperfect contrition is you are afraid of sin because you're afraid it will lead to your punishment in hell. Perfect contrition is you're afraid of sinning because you love God and you don't want Him to be disappointed. You don't want to offend Him. So you love God for His own sake, not because of any benefit that might accrue to you. Ideally, we should have perfect contrition. Now, imperfect contrition is better than no contrition at all. If you must have contrition, imperfect contrition is better than nothing. But ideally, we should go beyond imperfect contrition and move on to perfect contrition, which is, despising sin because of love of God, not fear of punishment. And that's the same thing that Hebrews and St. John are telling us, that we should love God, not because we're afraid of being punished, but because we love Him for His own sake. So, going back to verse 22, it says, we've come to Mount Zion. Now, this is an interesting note because these Hebrew Christians are probably not from Jerusalem. Well, we're not exactly sure. It's written in Greek, so probably they're diaspora Jews. But even if they were in Jerusalem, they may have lost access to the temple already, because we know that, especially ever since that incident with St. Paul in the temple, it would have been very difficult to be a follower of Yeshua and worship in the temple. The author of Hebrews is telling his readers that you don't have to worry about losing access to the temple, because there is a better temple in store for you. And this better temple is the heavenly Jerusalem. So Platonic thought began to influence certain strands of Hellenistic Jewish thought in the first century. So I don't know how much you all know about Platonism. So this is a little bit of a crash course in philosophy. But in Platonic philosophy, there's this the idea that um, things on earth are just imperfect copies of ideal forms. So Let's take my little tumbler here. So this is an imperfect copy of a tumbler, and there is a perfect form of a tumbler somewhere up there in the ether. Now, a lot of Christians began to take on Platonic ideas. Augustine was known to have been a Christian Platonist, for example. And Second Temple Jews also were to an extent influenced by Platonism. And this began to influence the way they thought of Jerusalem and the temple. They began to think of the earthly Jerusalem and the heaven and the earthly temple as imperfect copies of heavenly prototypes. And if you read closely the New Testament, there are hints of that. So here's one of them: the idea of a heavenly Jerusalem, a heavenly Mount Zion that is superior to the one that you find here on earth. And Hebrews is saying, you've come to it. Not that you're literally there already, but that you have been guaranteed access to it through the new covenant. Interestingly, St. Paul in Galatians kind of talks about this at one point as well. He talks about the Jerusalem below and the Jerusalem above. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, it's actually in Galatians 4, verses 24 to 26. So this is um, Paul is using an allegory. He's using Hagar and Sarah as his examples. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. These two women are two covenants. One is Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. So, chronologically, Galatians is the first book in the New Testament to hint at the idea of a heavenly Jerusalem that is superior to the earthly one. Um, the most explicit reference to the heavenly Jerusalem, of course, is in the book of Revelation, where it talks about the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. So this is in Revelation 21, verses 1 to 4, and says this: Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. So this heavenly Jerusalem actually comes down to earth. So we talk about going to heaven when we die, but really, it's not so much that we're going to heaven as it is heaven is coming down to earth. There's a really nice video on YouTube if anyone wants to look it up. It's on the Bible Project website, and it's about how heaven and earth will reunite on the last day. I forgot the title, but I'm sure someone can find it. But they make a really interesting point where that the Bible thinks of heaven and earth not as two completely separate spheres, but as partially overlapping. And that part of God's design for the cosmos is to completely unite heaven and earth on the last day, which we see in Revelation 21. And Hebrews is alluding to the same idea, which is that as believers, we have access to heaven, but the heaven that we're being given access to is not just some ethereal place that we go to after we die. It is something that will merge with our present reality on the last day. Now, whether we are still alive on this earth or not to see it happen is another story. But rest assured that if you continue to trust in the Lord, you will see it. In verse 23, it says, And to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, the assembly of the firstborn. So it's an interesting description because the firstborn is something that is normally used to describe Israel. So in the book of Exodus, for example, God refers to Israel as his firstborn. But notice that now in Hebrews, the author of Hebrews refers to believers in Jesus as the firstborn. So right there, you have another one of those passages that hints at the idea that the church is the new Israel. So I'm actually planning to create a presentation on the idea of the church as the new Israel. So I'm talking to Michael about that, and hopefully that'll be made available at some point in the future, God willing. But Hebrews 12 is one of the key passages that we're going to go through to unpack that idea. So the assembly of the firstborn are enrolled in heaven. So their names are written down, apographo in Greek. So there's the idea that their names are written down somewhere. Now, this is probably a reference to the book of life. So in Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15, it shows us the great white throne judgment. It talks about the fact that there is a book of life. And it's only those whose names are in the book of life who get to experience the new heavens and new earth. Those whose names are not on it get tossed into the lake of fire. So the assembly of the firstborn are those who are enrolled in the book of life in heaven. And, of course, the most important thing in this heavenly Jerusalem is God himself. So God is the judge of all, and the spirits of the righteous made perfect. So God dwells with the spirits of the righteous, those who have run the race successfully. So ultimately, our desire is for God. Heaven is only heaven because God is there, and our desire should be to get closer to Him. It's this reminds me of a passage from Psalm 73, one of my favorite psalms. It says here, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And there's nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength in my heart and my portion forever." So the psalmist is saying that his greatest desire is to be united to God. And here, Hebrews is telling us that in Christ we have that unity with God. And verse 24, "And to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." There are exactly two people in the New Testament who are described as mediators. The first one is Moses. Moses is referred to as the mediator of the Old Covenant. And that's in, don't remember where exactly, but I believe it is somewhere in Galatians. Someone can find the exact passage for me. But the idea is that both the Old and the New Covenants required a mediator. And in the Old Covenant, that was Moses. Moses is the one who goes up to the mountain and speaks to God on behalf of the people. Moses is the one who receives the stone tablets from up in the mountain and brings it down to the people. Moses is the one who gives the law to the people, who lets them know what God expects of them. So he's a mediator in that sense. But Moses is an imperfect mediator. He is a sinner just like we are. And because of that, he cannot mediate perfectly. Jesus is a perfect mediator because he never sinned. So St. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3 says he committed no sin, nor was there any deceit found in his mouth. So um, in order for the new covenant to be superior to the old covenant, it must have a superior mediator. So that's one of the arguments that Hebrews is making. Jesus is better than Moses. Therefore, the covenant he mediates is better. And it is better because Jesus inaugurated with his blood. Remember in the Last Supper, Jesus says, "This is the blood of the covenant, which will be shed for you." So through the shedding of his blood, the new covenant comes into effect. So the last part of the epistle talks about the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So the sprinkled blood here, of course, is the blood of Christ, which was shed for us on the cross. Why does it speak a better word than the blood of Abel? Well, in order to understand that, we have to go back to Genesis. So, for a refresher, you have Cain and Abel, the two sons of Adam and Eve. Cain gets jealous of his brother and kills his brother. And then he has a little conversation with God. God says, "Where's your brother?" Cain says, "I'm my brother's keeper." And then we read in verses not in verse 10 and 11, the Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." So Abel's blood basically condemns Cain, because Abel's blood cries out to God for vengeance. So that is what it talks about when Jesus' blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. By the way, here's a little fun fact. If you read the Masoretic text, you'll only get this from the Masoretic text. The Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Samaritan Pentateuch all read differently. The word for blood is in the plural. It says, "Kol deme achicha tzoakim alai." So deme or damim is the plural of dam, which is the Hebrew word for blood. It's literally the voice of the bloods of your brother. And the rabbis puzzled over this because it never occurs to them that this could just be a textual variant. And they ask, why is it bloods in the plural? And in the Talmud, it says it is bloods in the plural because when Cain murdered Abel, he did not just murder Abel, but all of the descendants Abel would have had if Abel had lived. And so the rabbis conclude that when a man murders another man, he is murdering not just that man, but every single person that could have ever existed had that man not been murdered. So every murderer is in effect murdering a whole world full of men through that action. That tells you how serious the idea of murder is. That quote finds its way into the Quran, by the way. In Surah 5, it talks about how a murderer, if someone murders, it's as if they had murdered a whole world. But the one who spares a life, it's as if they had spared a whole world. So the Quran is influenced by the Talmud in that place. Now, Jesus' word speaks a better word than the blood of Abel, because the blood of Abel speaks of vengeance, of justice. It cries out for revenge. Jesus does not cry out for revenge. Remember when he was on the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Instead, Jesus' blood speaks forgiveness. Jesus' blood reconciles us to God. You know, for all the Catholics, think about the Divine Mercy Chaplet. What do we say? "O blood and water which gush forth from the heart of Jesus, fountain of mercy for us, we trust in you." So we're not literally speaking to blood, by the way. The Divine Mercy Chaplet is meant to be figurative, but the idea is we trust in the blood of Christ to grant us access to the mercy of God. So the whole point of our reading in Hebrews is in Christ, in the new covenant, we have that access. We have forgiveness. We have confidence to come before God. We have the inheritance of the New Jerusalem, and we cannot trade that for anything in the world. So hopefully that will inspire you to greater love and devotion to our Lord. Now, let's get to Luke chapter 14. Now we're getting to the gospel reading. It was a very interesting gospel reading, if I may say so myself. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. Now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, Give your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit in the lowest place so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who exalts himself will be exalted. He said also to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. And when you give a feast, invite the poor, the cripple, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the just." Oh, also note, um, for the gospel, the acclamation is from Matthew 11:29, where it says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Jesus is saying he is gentle and lowly in heart. So remember, one of the key themes of our readings is humility, going all the way back to the Old Testament reading from Sirach. So Jesus is the example of humility par excellence. And Philippians chapter 2 also talks about this, how he humbled himself by taking on the form of a servant. Even though he had the form of God, he did not regard that as something to be held on to. So now, Jesus is about to put a bunch of people in their place, no pun intended. Notice that there's a gap in the reading. We don't cover verses 2 through 6. That's Jesus getting into another argument with the Pharisees over proper Sabbath protocol. Jesus seems to go out of his way to heal people on the Sabbath, because there are at least two other places elsewhere in the Gospels where Jesus does the same thing. Someone is sick and or they're injured and Jesus heals them on Sabbath. You had the man with the withered hand, and you had the hunched over woman just one chapter earlier. So it seems that Jesus has to do it again just to drive the point home. In fact, what is this man doing in the Pharisee's house anyway? It's almost as if he had been invited to come there to test Jesus. Luke doesn't say that explicitly, but a lot of commentators have inferred that from the reading. But anyway, we shall talk a little bit about the parable. By the way, all of this takes place in the house of a ruler of the Pharisees. What is Jesus doing in the house of a ruler of the Pharisees? Well, remember that the Pharisees were a very broad tent, so they're not all alike. There were undoubtedly many moderate Pharisees who were probably open to Jesus' teaching. They may not have necessarily been hostile to him, and perhaps this Pharisee was one of them. But even so, this particular person may have been a little bit skeptical because they know Jesus has a reputation for transgressing the rules that the Pharisees placed. This is, by the way, the third time that Jesus dines with a Pharisee. It also happens in Luke 7:36 to 50, as well as in Luke 11:37 to 54. Now, this particular this particular lunch happens on a Sabbath. So it is customary in Jewish communities to have a Sabbath lunch right after the synagogue worship. If you ever go to synagogue, you will be invited to lunch with the community afterwards. Something that you might want to consider if you ever want to go to a synagogue. But anyway, you have Jesus here, and he's dining, and he notices that people like to choose the best seats. That's in verse 7. He told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the place of honor. So people have a tendency to want to pick the best spots. In Matthew chapter 23, when you read the seven woes to the scribes and Pharisees, one of the woes is that the scribes and the Pharisees love to pick the best seats in the synagogues. So Jesus called them out on it in the Holy Week. But this is based on prior experience, as we can see. Now, the best seat is usually the seat that's closest to the host, the person who owns the house. So the closer you are to the person who owns the house, the more honored you are. Now, you might think to yourself, isn't it kind of arrogant to try to sit next to the owner of the house? But, one of the recurring things throughout human history is that people who assert themselves tend to be rewarded for it. People were told to be assertive, to, you know, grab what we want and not be apologetic about it. And that's how you get what you want. So Jesus is here turning that kind of logic upside down by saying, don't be like that. So in verse 8, he says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. So you never know who's invited to a party. There could be a dignitary there that is more important than you, and you don't want to be taking his seat, would you? Nowadays, we tend not to have that problem because we're usually told in advance if there's a dignitary coming, and usually their spot has already been reserved, so we don't make the mistake of sitting in someone's reserved seat. Now, in verse 9 it says, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. So you don't want to be put in position of being told to move down because it comes off as not knowing your place. Now, in verse 10, Jesus says, but when you're invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher, then you'll be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. So Jesus is saying, be humble. Try to pick the lowest seat. Be the guy who sits in the back where nobody will notice you. Because maybe, just maybe, someone will come up to you and be like, come forward, sit closer to front. In verse 11, Jesus says, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. One of the recurring themes of the Gospel of Luke is that the proud are put in their place. So think of Mary's Magnificat, where he says, or she says, he has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. So God is reversing the power dynamics of the world here. So the proud are those who are going to be humbled. So Jesus is saying it's very important that we not think too highly of ourselves or think more highly of ourselves than we deserve because God's going to put us in our place. And here's the interesting note here. This is not just something for good manners when you're at someone's house. So this has practical applications in everyday settings, but it's primarily about not being humbled or not being humiliated on the last day when you stand before the Lord. You don't want the Lord to tell you that you have been arrogant in the present life. So the way we conduct ourselves among our fellow men in this life is going to determine how we're going to be judged on the last day. In verse 12, Jesus says to the man who invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. So there's a tendency for us to want to invite people because we want to build up a little bit of social capital with them. We want to we want to have some favors that we can call in later down the road. It's understandable. We want to think that way. That's especially the case if we have friends who are wealthy benefactors. We're hoping that maybe some of our guests can give us some money, you know? But Jesus says we shouldn't think like that. In verse 13, he says, when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. These are the people who don't usually get such invites because they are social undesirables. And if this was written in the 21st century, some people might think, oh, you want to invite the welfare people, the ones who can't provide for themselves? They're just a drain. They're just, they just suck up all the resources and they don't contribute anything. Jesus is telling us we shouldn't think like that. In verse 14, he says, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So you can have your recompense in this life, or you can have it in the life hereafter. Which one do you prefer? So a lot of us, we want recompense here and now. The problem is if we get the recompense here and now, we don't get anything in the next life. So we should aim to have the recompense that Jesus provides in the next life. You want to think long term, you know. If you have any experience with investing, you want to invest for the long term. And the most important holding period is eternity. So you want the investment that pays dividends into eternity. That is the kind of investment that you get when you provide for those who cannot pay you back. So Jesus is saying that we should be charitable. Notice that the gospel reading kind of mirrors the Old Testament reading. Both of them start off by telling us to be humble, and then they pivot towards telling us to be charitable. So Sirach, our reading from Sirach, starts with humility and ends with charity. The gospel reading starts with humility and ends with charity. So charity and humility go together. The humble person is the charitable person, and vice versa. So we need to be both. We need to be humble. We need to not think too highly of ourselves. We need to be charitable. We need to provide for others, but in such a way that we're not self aggrandizing. So, very nice practical readings that we have here about how to live a good Christian life, humility and charity. I'm sure that we can all use a tad more of those things in our life. And hopefully, my prayer is that we will all learn to be a little bit more like Christ in that regard. So, once again, thank you for listening in to this Bible study. If you found it helpful, be sure to share it with someone you know who could benefit from it, especially someone who is a priest, a deacon, or a catechist. Hopefully, this will help them with their homilies or their Bible studies or their lessons. And then next week, we are going to cover the 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, where we'll actually be reading the Wisdom of Solomon next. And we'll be covering Psalm 90, the Book of Philemon, and Luke 14, verses 25 to 33. So thank you very much for listening. So maybe I'll just say a quick glory be to close us off. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. And thank you very much for listening, and God bless you.